The ultimate betrayal does not happen in a dark alleyway with a weapon in hand. It happens in a brightly lit dining room, surrounded by the people who are supposed to love you the most. I never expected that a casual Sunday evening would become the moment I had to fight for my survival. As we sat around the table, the laughter of my family echoed off the walls while a silent executioner sat right beside me, pretending to be my protector. My name is Clara Vance, and at 29 years old, I discovered that the man I married was actively trying to end my life. My husband, Nolan, was deep in conversation with his father, gesturing wildly as he recounted a story from his office. He looked completely normal, a picture-perfect spouse in a room filled with his adoring relatives. His mother had spent hours preparing her signature chicken soup, a comfort food that now carried a deadly secret. Just seconds before, I caught a glimpse of Nolan's hand hovering directly over my bowl. His fingers parted slightly, dropping something minuscule into the steaming liquid before it vanished into the broth completely. My heart hammered violently against my ribs as a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. Nolan turned back to me with a look that seemed entirely artificial, asking if I was going to enjoy my meal. I managed to force a tight smile, claiming that I was simply waiting for the soup to cool down before taking a bite. "Excuse me for just a moment," I murmured, standing up from the table while keeping my posture as rigid as possible. I walked down the hallway to the bathroom, locking the door securely behind me. My hands shook violently as I splashed freezing water onto my face, staring at my reflection in pure terror. For the past few months, Nolan's behavior had shifted in ways that I foolishly chose to ignore. He was constantly working late, hiding his phone screen, and stepping out into the backyard to take hushed phone calls. I originally convinced myself that he was planning something special for our upcoming wedding anniversary. Looking in the mirror, the agonizing truth finally became clear, and I knew I needed a strategic plan to survive this night. When I returned to the dining room, the chaotic energy of the family gathering provided the exact distraction I desperately needed. Nolan's sister was busy cleaning up a spill from her toddler, and his mother had stepped into the kitchen to check on dessert. Nolan glanced down at a text message on his phone, breaking his gaze from my bowl for a single second. I moved with lightning speed, silently swapping my poison bowl with his mother's untouched portion. Nolan looked up just as I lifted a spoonful of the safe soup to my lips, swallowing it while maintaining direct eye contact. He visibly relaxed, a smug and satisfied expression crossing his face as he praised his mother's cooking. A moment later, his mother sat back down at the table and reached for the very bowl Nolan had laced with poison. Nolan froze mid-sentence, his entire countenance turning an ashen shade of pale as he realized what was happening. He tried to protest, stammering out a weak warning for her to save room for the apple pie, but it was already too late. His mother smiled warmly and swallowed two large spoonfuls of the soup while Nolan stared at her in absolute horror. I carefully checked my watch, noting that the time was exactly 42 minutes past 6. I needed to document every single symptom and timeline if I was going to prove what he had done. Within 5 minutes, the atmosphere in the room completely shifted as his mother began coughing and complaining about a sudden, intense heat. Her hands trembled violently as she pressed them against her chest, her breathing growing shallow and labored. Nolan practically leapt out of his chair, urging her to lie down as panic consumed him. Suddenly, her eyes rolled back into her head, and she collapsed entirely into his arms as the family erupted into screams. The emergency sirens wailed in the distance, arriving 12 minutes later to rush her to the nearest medical center. Nolan rode in the back of the ambulance, leaving me behind at the house with his panicked sister and the children. After convincing his sister to take the kids upstairs to bed, I immediately went to work in the deserted kitchen. I donned rubber gloves, carefully pouring the remaining soup into airtight containers and hiding them in my bag. I immediately contacted my estranged brother, Vance, who happened to manage a high-level forensic toxicology laboratory downtown. Meeting him in the driveway 30 minutes later, I pressed the evidence into his hands and begged him to run a full chemical panel. He warned me that a proper screening would take at least 24 hours, but I told him my life depended on a faster turnaround. I then walked back inside, waiting in the dark for my husband to return. Nolan walked through the front door at 3 in the morning, looking completely drained as he claimed his mother suffered a sudden cardiac event. He sat beside me, weeping softly and confessing that he had hidden $200,000 of debt from me due to bad investments. It was in that exact moment that everything clicked, remembering the $500,000 life insurance policy he had convinced me to sign, which doubled in the event of an accidental death. The following afternoon, my phone rang with an urgent update from Vance, confirming the soup was heavily saturated with lethal amounts of digitalis. He explained that someone had deliberately crushed heart medication into the food, creating a concentration high enough to cause immediate cardiac arrest. Shortly after, Nolan texted me a photo of his mother's new prescriptions, which included that exact medication. He asked me to pick them up and bring them to the house. I arrived at the house and slipped upstairs quietly, following the sound of clinking glass coming from the master bathroom. I pushed the door open, catching Nolan red-handed as he used a mortar and pestle to grind his mother's pills into a fine white powder. I immediately activated the audio recorder on my phone, confronting him about the digitalis he had slipped into my soup the previous night. His loving facade completely evaporated, replaced by a chillingly vacant stare. He laughed quietly, stepping toward me and claiming that my stolen soup samples and audio recordings would never hold up in a court of law. When I revealed that I had also copied his financial records and that his fingerprints were all over the pill bottles, his eyes narrowed with rage. He lunged forward, twisting my wrist until my phone fell to the tile floor, before wrapping his hands tightly around my throat to silence me forever. Suddenly, a gasp echoed from the doorway as his mother stood there, having discharged herself early and overhearing his entire murderous confession. Her arrival broke his grip, allowing me to collapse to the floor as his father called the authorities from the hallway. Nolan fled the house in a desperate panic, but the state police captured him 3 hours later near the border. The judicial process was grueling, but the overwhelming forensic evidence secured a conviction of 25 years to life. A year has passed since that terrifying dinner, and I have relocated to a completely new city to rebuild my existence from scratch. Trusting people is a mountain I am still learning how to climb, and the shadows of that night still linger in my mind. However, I survived because I chose to rely on logic rather than panic when the person I loved most turned against me. True safety is not guaranteed by a marriage vow, but by your own willingness to see the truth.